Kokoro. Sōseki Natsume. Part 1. Sensei and I. Chapter 1. I always called him Sensei, so I will refer to him only as Sensei here and not reveal his real name. This isn't because I wish to be discreet or out of concern for social propriety, but simply because that's what feels natural to me. Whenever I recall him, the word Sensei springs to mind instantly. Even when writing, that feeling does not change. I can't bring myself to use something impersonal like an initial. I first became acquainted with Sensei in Kamakura. I was still a young student at the time. One of my friends, who had gone to the beach during summer vacation, sent me a postcard urging me to come. I scraped together a little money and decided to go. It took me 2 or 3 days to gather the funds. But less than 3 days after I arrived in Kamakura, the friend who had called me there received a telegram from his hometown, summoning him back urgently. The message said his mother was ill, but he didn't believe it. His parents had been pressuring him to marry someone he didn't want to, and he'd fled to the Tokyo area to avoid going home during the break. He showed me the telegram and asked what he should do. I didn't know what to say. Still, if his mother was truly ill, he was, of course, obliged to return. In the end, he decided to go back. I was left alone. With plenty of time before the school term began, I was free to either stay in Kamakura or return home. I decided to remain at the same lodging for the time being. My friend was the son of a wealthy Chinese businessman, and though he had no financial worries, being still young and a student, his lifestyle was not much different from mine. So when I found myself alone, I didn't bother looking for a new place to stay. The lodging was in a rather remote area of Kamakura. To get to anything fashionable, like billiards or ice cream, you had to cross a long embankment. Even taking a rickshaw cost 20 senator. Still, there were several private villas in the area, and the beach was nearby, making it very convenient for swimming. I went to the beach every day. Passing through old, smoke-darkened thatched cottages, I would climb down to the shore, where the beach bustled with men and women there for summer vacation. So much so that it was hard to believe this many city folk were staying in the area. Sometimes the sea was as crowded with bobbing black heads as a public bath. Although I knew no one, being surrounded by such lively scenes, lying on the sand or splashing around in the waves, was delightful. It was in that bustling crowd that I first spotted Sensei. There were 2 tea houses along the beach, and I had, by chance, grown accustomed to frequenting one of them. Unlike those with large villas and haze, many of the summer visitors in this area lacked private changing rooms and relied on these communal facilities. They drank tea, rested, washed their swimsuits, cleaned off the salty sea water, and left their hats and umbrellas there. I didn't own a swimsuit, but I still left all my belongings at the tea house whenever I went into the water, fearing they might be stolen. Chapter 2. The first time I saw Sensei at the tea house, he was just undressing to enter the sea, while I had just come out and was letting the wind dry my body. There were many heads moving between us, blocking my view. If not for a particular reason, I might have missed him altogether. The beach was that crowded, and my mind was that unfocused. But I spotted him right away because he was with a Westerner. The Westerner's extremely white skin immediately caught my eye as soon as they entered the tea house. He wore a plain Japanese yukata, which he tossed onto the bench and stood with arms folded, facing the sea. He wore nothing but Japanese-style underwear. That struck me as strange. Just 2 days earlier, I had gone as far as Yokohama and watched many Westerners swimming. Sitting on a small hill near the back entrance of a hotel, I had observed numerous men come out to bathe, all of whom kept their chests, arms, and thighs covered. The women were even more careful to conceal their bodies, often wearing rubber caps and swimming in subdued colors like shrimp brown or navy blue. Compared to them, this man, standing unabashedly in nothing but his underclothes, looked quite unusual. He soon turned to the Japanese man beside him, who was crouched picking up a towel, and said something briefly. That man, Sensei, wrapped the towel around his head and began walking toward the sea. Out of sheer curiosity, I watched the two of them head down to the shore. They stepped straight into the waves and swam through the crowd until they reached a relatively open spot and began to swim. Their heads became smaller and smaller as they moved far out, then returned in a straight line to the beach. After coming back to the tea house, they wiped themselves off and got dressed without even rinsing at the well, then left quickly. After they left, I sat again on my bench, smoking a cigarette and thinking absent-mindedly about Sensei. I had a strange feeling that I'd seen his face somewhere before, but I couldn't remember where or when. At that time, I was less carefree than I was restless and bored. The next day, I made a point to go to the tea house again around the same time. The Westerner didn't come, but Sensei arrived wearing a straw hat. He took off his glasses, placed them on the bench, wrapped his head with a towel, and walked down to the beach. When he swam alone through the noisy crowd, I suddenly wanted to follow him. I splashed through the shallow water, then swam toward him. But unlike the day before, Sensei swam in an arc and returned to shore from a different direction, so I couldn't catch up to him. By the time I got back and entered the tea house, he was already dressed and walking out. Chapter 3. The next day, I went to the beach again at the same time and saw Sensei's face. And the day after that, I repeated the same routine, but we still hadn't exchanged any words or even greetings. Moreover, Sensei's demeanor was rather unsociable. He came and went at the same time each day with an aloof air. No matter how lively the beach was, he seemed to pay it no mind. The Westerner never reappeared. Sensei always came alone. One day, as usual, Sensei returned from the sea and went to put on his yukata, which he had left in its usual spot, but it was covered in sand for some reason. He turned around and shook it off, and in the process, his glasses fell through a gap in the bench. After tying his sash over his white cotton kimono, he seemed to notice they were missing and began searching. I immediately reached under the bench and retrieved the glasses. He said, "Thank you," and took them from my hand. The next day, I jumped into the sea right after Sensei and swam in the same direction. After going about 200 meters offshore, he turned around and spoke to me. There was no one else nearby, just the two of us floating on the wide blue sea. The strong sunlight lit the water and mountains as far as the eye could see. I felt my muscles moving freely, filled with joy, as I played in the sea. Sensei suddenly stopped swimming, floated on his back, and lay on the waves. I mimicked him. The glaring sky threw its intense blue color at my face. "It feels great," I shouted. After a while, Sensei adjusted his posture in the water and said, "Shall we go back?" I had more energy and wanted to swim longer, but since Sensei suggested it, I happily replied, "Sure, let's go." And we returned to the beach together. That was the beginning of our friendship, yet I still didn't know where Sensei was staying. A few days later, I believe it was the afternoon of the third day, I met Sensei again at the tea house. He suddenly asked, "Do you plan to stay here much longer?" I hadn't really thought about it, so I answered, "I'm not sure." Seeing the smile on Sensei's face, I felt awkward and asked, "What about you, Sensei?" That was the first time I addressed him as Sensei. That evening, I visited his lodging. It wasn't a typical inn, but more like a villa on the grounds of a large temple. I also learned that the people he was staying with were not his family. When I called him Sensei, he gave a wry smile, and I explained it was just a habit of mine when speaking to elders. I asked about the Westerner. Sensei told me the man was eccentric and had already left Kamakura. He found it odd that he had even befriended a foreigner, since he hardly associated with other Japanese people either. Finally, I told Sensei I felt like I'd seen him somewhere before, but couldn't recall when or where. I wondered silently if he might feel the same about me. But after thinking quietly for a moment, he said, "I don't remember your face at all. Maybe you're mistaken." His words left me with a strange feeling of disappointment. Chapter 4. I returned to Tokyo at the end of the month. Sensei had left the summer resort long before that. When I parted from him, I asked, "May I visit your home from time to time?" Sensei simply said, "Yes, do come," in a plain and curt manner. At the time, I believed we had grown fairly close, so I expected a more cordial response. His reserved reply wounded my confidence a little. This was not the first time Sensei had disappointed me in such ways. Sometimes he seemed aware of it, and at other times, completely oblivious. Yet, even with the repeated minor disappointments, I never felt inclined to distance myself from him. On the contrary, each time I felt shaken with unease, I only wanted to draw closer. I believed that if I went a little further, the thing I was hoping for would someday appear clearly before my eyes. I was young, but I didn't think youthful blood flowed this sincerely for everyone. Why did I feel this way only towards Sensei? That, I didn't understand at the time. It is only now, after Sensei has passed away, that I have begun to understand. It wasn't that he disliked me from the start. His occasional curt greetings and seemingly cold demeanor were not expressions of displeasure or attempts to push me away. The sorrowful man that he was, he meant to warn people who tried to get close to him, saying, "Don't bother, there is nothing of value here." A man who did not return others' affection, it seems, was one who, before despising others, already despised himself. I returned to Tokyo with the intention of visiting Sensei. There were still 2 weeks before classes began, and I thought I would visit him once during that time. However, as 2 or 3 days passed, the feeling I had in Kamakura began to fade. The atmosphere of the big city, filled with sharp stimuli that revived memories, deeply colored my heart. Each time I saw students on the street, I felt a new sense of hope and tension for the coming academic year. I forgot about Sensei for a while. After about a month of classes, a certain slackness crept into my heart again. I began to walk the streets with a vaguely dissatisfied expression and restlessly scanned the corners of my room. Sensei's face returned to my mind. I felt the urge to see him once more. The first time I visited his home, Sensei was not in. The second time, I remember clearly, it was a sunny Sunday, the kind of clear weather that soaks into your body. Yet again, Sensei was out. I remembered hearing from Sensei himself in Kamakura that he was almost always at home, and even disliked going out. So having missed him twice in a row, I couldn't help but feel a vague sense of dissatisfaction. I didn't leave the front step immediately. I hesitated a little upon seeing the maid's face. Recognizing me from the previous visit when I had left my calling card, she went inside. A woman, who appeared to be Sensei's wife, came out instead. She was beautiful. She kindly told me where Sensei had gone. It was apparently his custom to visit a certain grave in the Zashigaya cemetery on that day every month to offer flowers. He just left, perhaps 10 minutes ago, she said with a look of regret. I bowed and stepped outside. After walking about a block toward the lively part of town, I felt like taking a stroll to Zashigaya myself. There was also a bit of curiosity. Would I see Sensei or not? So I turned on my heel.
Chapter 5. I entered from the left side of the seedling field just before the cemetery, and walked down the broad path lined with maple trees on both sides. From the edge, I saw someone who looked like Sensei suddenly emerge from a tea house. I walked up close enough to see the rims of his glass gleaming in the sunlight and called out loudly, "Sensei." He stopped abruptly and looked at me. "How did you How did you? Sensei repeated the same phrase twice. In the still silence of the midday, his words sounded strangely out of place. I suddenly found myself unable to respond. Did you follow me here? How did you? His demeanor was rather calm. His voice was rather subdued. Yet there was an indistinct shadow in his expression, something I couldn't judge in your quiet name. I explained to Sensei how I came to be there. Did my wife tell you whose grave I was visiting? No, she didn't judge in your say anything like that. I see. Yes, there is in your be no reason for her to tell someone she just met. There is in your be no need. He seemed to have finally come to terms with something. But I had no idea what he meant. Sensei and I walked between the graves toward the main road. There were tombstones marked with things like Isabella such and such, God's servant login, and wooden grave tablets bearing the Buddhist phrase, all sentient beings have Buddha nature. There was even one for His Excellency, the envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary. At a small tomb engraved with the name Andrew, I asked Sensei, how do you read this? They probably meant it to be read ichiju of Andre, ichiju of. He replied with a wry smile. Unlike me, Sensei didn't ichiju of seem to find as much irony or amusement in the various nationalities and styles of the gravestone. At first, he quietly listened to me chattering about the round stones or the slender granite markers, but eventually, he said, You ichiju of V never seriously thought about this, have you? I fell silent. So did he, saying nothing more. At the edge of the cemetery stood a large ginkgo tree towering toward the sky. As we came under it, Sensei looked up at the high branches. In a little while, this will be beautiful. When the whole tree turns golden and the ground here is covered in yellow leaves. He passed beneath this tree once a month without fail. A man flattening the uneven ground in the distance, preparing a new burial site, paused his work and looked at us. From there, we turned left and came out onto the road. With no particular destination in mind, I simply followed Sensei's lead. He was more silent than usual, but I didn't ichiju feel especially uncomfortable, so we wandered along together. Are you heading straight home now? Yes, I ichiju V no other place to stop. We walked downhill to the south without speaking further. Is that where your family's grave is? I asked. No. Whose grave is it, then? A relative's? No. He gave no further answer. I let the matter drop. But about a block later, Sensei suddenly returned to the topic. That's the grave of a friend of mine. You visit your friend's grave every month? Yes. That was all Sensei said that day.
Chapter 6. After that, I began to visit Sensei occasionally. Each time I went, he was at home. As the number of visits grew, I found myself going more and more frequently. However, his attitude toward me did not change much, whether it was our first meeting or after we'd grown more familiar. He was always quiet. Sometimes, his quietness felt almost lonely. From the beginning, I sensed something strangely unapproachable about him. Yet I also felt an undeniable need to get closer to him. Perhaps I alone, among many others, felt this way. But later, my intuition was proven true by real events. So even if others call me naive or laugh at me as foolish, I still take pride and joy in that youthful intuition. A man capable of love, who cannot help but love, yet is unable to stretch out his arms and embrace those who seek the warmth of his heart. That was Sensei. As I've said, Sensei was always calm, composed. Yet, sometimes a strange shadow would pass across his face, like a blackbird silhouette suddenly flitting across a window. It would vanish quickly, but I noticed it. The first time I saw that shadow on his brow was when I surprised him at the cemetery in Zashigaya. In that odd moment, my heart, which had been calmly flowing, skipped a beat. But that moment passed quickly. My heart regained its usual steadiness within 5 minutes. I forgot about the dark shadow after that. It wasn't until a certain evening in late autumn, not far from the end of the season, that I was unexpectedly reminded of it. While speaking with Sensei, I suddenly thought of the great ginkgo tree he had once pointed out to me. I did the math and realized that his next monthly visit to the grave was 3 days away. That day happened to be a free day for me, with my classes ending at noon. I said to Sensei, "Sensei, do you think the ginkgo leaves in Zashigaya have all fallen already?" "They probably haven't all dropped just yet," he said, watching my face intently. Then he didn't look away. I immediately followed up. "Would it be alright if I went with you to the cemetery this time? I'd like to stroll around there with you." "I'm going to pay respects to a grave, not to take a stroll," he replied. "But wouldn't a walk be a nice addition to your visit?" He gave no answer. After a while, he said, "For me, it's purely a grave visit." He seemed intent on drawing a clear line between visiting the grave and taking a stroll. I wondered whether he was just making excuses not to go with me. He struck me, in that moment, as strangely childlike. Still, I pressed further. "Then I'll visit the grave too. Please take me with you." To me, there seemed to be little difference between a grave visit and a stroll. But then Sensei's brows slightly furrowed. A strange light appeared in his eyes. It wasn't quite displeasure or rejection or fear. It was a faint, unnameable unease. I was suddenly struck by the memory of calling out Sensei at the cemetery. The expression on his face then and now was exactly the same. "I," said Sensei, "I have a reason I cannot share with you, but I do not want anyone else accompanying me there. Not even my own wife has ever gone with me." Chapter 7. I found it curious, but I didn't visit the teacher's home with the intention of studying him. I simply let things take their course. Looking back now, I think my attitude at the time was one of the more admirable aspects of my life. I believe it was precisely because of this that I was able to form a warm, human relationship with him. Had my curiosity been even slightly directed at his inner life with a probing mindset, the thread of sympathy connecting us would have surely been cut without mercy. In my youth, I wasn't even aware of my own attitude. Perhaps that's why it was admirable. But had I made a wrong turn, who knows what might have come between us? The very thought sends a chill down my spine. Even without that, the teacher constantly feared being scrutinized by cold, analytical eyes. I began to visit the teacher's home regularly, 2 or 3 times a month. One day, when my visits had become more frequent, the teacher suddenly asked me, Why do you come so often to the home of someone like me? There's no special reason, I replied. But am I bothering you? I wouldn't say that. Indeed, there wasn't the slightest sign that I was a nuisance. I knew the teacher's circle of acquaintances was extremely limited. I also knew that of his former classmates, only 2 or 3 were still in Tokyo. Occasionally, I would share the room with students from his hometown, but none of them seemed to share the same closeness with him that I did. I'm a lonely man, the teacher said, so I'm happy you come. That's why I asked why you visit so often. Then why ask? When I asked this, the teacher didn't reply. He just looked at me and said, "How old are you?" This exchange seemed rather vague to me, but I didn't press the issue further and went home. Yet within 4 days, I visited him again. As soon as he entered the room, he laughed. "You've come again," he said. "Yes, I have," I answered with a laugh of my own. Had someone else said that to me, I might have taken offense. But coming from the teacher, it had the opposite effect. Rather than annoying me, it made me feel cheerful. I'm a lonely man. The teacher repeated the words he had spoken a few nights before. I'm lonely, but perhaps you are too. I'm old enough to endure it, but a young man like you must feel the need to move about. You probably want to go out and crash into something. I don't feel lonely at all. There's nothing lonelier than being young. If that's true, then why do you come to my house so often? Again, the same question passed from the teacher's lips. Even when you're with me, I suspect you still feel a lingering loneliness somewhere inside. I don't have the power to pull that loneliness out from its root. Eventually, you'll turn elsewhere and reach your hands outward. Eventually, your feet will stop coming here. With those words, the teacher gave a lonely smile. Chapter 8. Fortunately, the teacher's prediction didn't come true. At the time, I lacked the experience to fully understand the clear implication in his words. I continued to visit him regularly. Before I realized it, I was dining at his table. Naturally, this meant I had to converse with his wife as well. As an ordinary man, I wasn't indifferent to women, but due to the circumstances I had lived through up to that point, I had hardly had any meaningful interaction with them. Perhaps as a result, my interest was more easily piqued by unknown women I passed in the street. When I first saw the teacher's wife at the front door, I found her beautiful, and every time I saw her after that, I had the same impression. But beyond that, I didn't feel I had anything in particular to say about her. This may not have been due to a lack of personality on her part, but rather the lack of opportunity to reveal it. Still, I always felt about her as if she were a part of the teacher, an extension of him. It seemed she treated me kindly because I was a student visiting her husband. Without the teacher between us, we would likely have remained strangers. So, from that first impression, the only feeling I retained was that she was beautiful. One day, I was offered some sake at the teacher's home. His wife came in and poured for me. The teacher looked happier than usual. He offered her his cup and said, "Have a drink yourself." She started to decline, but then reluctantly accepted it. With a slight frown on her beautiful brow, she brought the half-filled cup to her lips. A casual exchange began between the two. How unusual. You almost never ask me to drink. You don't like it, that's why. But once in a while, it's good. It makes you feel nice. Not at all. It just feels awful. But you seem quite cheerful tonight after a little sake. Sometimes I do get cheerful, but it's not always that way. How about tonight? Tonight, I feel good. Maybe you should drink a little every night. I can't do that. You should. It might make things feel less lonely. In the teacher's home, it was just the couple and their maid. Whenever I visited, the house was always quiet. I never once heard any loud laughter. At times, it felt as if the only people inside were the teacher and me. It would be nice to have a child, the wife said, turning to me. Yes, I suppose so, I replied. But I felt no sympathy. At that time, never having had a child, I considered children little more than noisy nuisances. Shall we adopt one? The teacher said. An adopted child? The wife said, again turning to me. We'll never have a child of our own, the teacher said. The wife fell silent. When I asked, why not? In her place, the teacher laughed loudly and said, because it's divine punishment. Chapter 9. As far as I knew, the teacher and his wife were a happy couple. Since I had never lived in a family setting, I didn't fully grasp the details, but I often saw the teacher call his wife, her name was Shizu, instead of the maid when he needed something. He would call softly, Shizu. Turning toward the sliding door, his tone always sounded gentle to me. When she replied and appeared, her demeanor was always calm. On the occasions I was invited to a meal, the relationship between them seemed even more clearly and warmly drawn. Sometimes, the teacher would take his wife to concerts or the theater. According to my memory, they also went on short trips together, 2 or 3 times at least. I still have a postcard from Hakone. When they went to Nikko, I received a letter with a maple leaf enclosed. That was how their relationship appeared to me at the time. There was only one exception. One day, as I stood at the front door intending to ask to be shown in, I heard voices from the sitting room. It didn't sound like a normal conversation. It sounded like an argument. Since the sitting room was right next to the entrance, I could hear the tone clearly. One of the voices, the louder and male one, was clearly the teacher's. The other voice, quieter and female, seemed to be his wife's. She sounded as if she might be crying. I was unsure what to do, but eventually I turned around and went back to my lodging. A strange uneasiness crept over me. I couldn't concentrate on reading. After about an hour, the teacher came by my window and called my name. Surprised, I opened it. He invited me for a walk. Checking the watch still tucked in my sash, I saw it was past 8. I was still in my hakama. I went out just as I was. That night, we had beer together. The teacher was not much of a drinker. If a certain amount didn't make him tipsy, he wouldn't go further just to get there. No good tonight, he said with a bitter smile. Can't feel cheerful? I asked sympathetically. I couldn't get that earlier scene out of my mind. Like a fishbone stuck in my throat, it nagged at me. I wavered. Should I ask him about it or not? You seem off tonight, the teacher said. To be honest, I'm feeling a bit odd myself. Can you tell? I couldn't answer. I had a bit of a quarrel with my wife earlier. It left my nerves unsettled, he said. Why? I couldn't bring myself to say the word quarrel. She misunderstood me. Even when I tried to explain, she wouldn't accept it. I lost my temper. What kind of misunderstanding? The teacher didn't answer. If I were really the kind of man she imagines, I wouldn't be suffering like this. How deeply he was suffering, I couldn't even begin to imagine. Chapter 10. As the two of us walked home, a long silence stretched between us for a block, then another. Then, all of a sudden, Sensei began to speak. I did something wrong. I stormed out in anger, so my wife is probably terribly worried. When I think about it, women are pitiful creatures. My wife, for example, has no one to rely on but me. Sensei's words broke off there, but without expecting any response from me. he immediately continued, saying that makes the husband sound so strong. It's almost ridiculous. Tell me, how do I appear to you? Do I seem like a strong person or a weak one? You seem somewhere in the middle, I replied. This answer seemed to surprise Sensei a little. He closed his mouth again and resumed walking in silence. To get to Sensei's house, we had to pass right by my boarding house. When we reached that point, I felt it would be rude to part ways at the corner. So I said, "Shall I walk with you as far as your house?" But Sensei immediately raised his hand to stop me. "It's late already. You'd better head home. I'm going straight home too, for my wife's sake." The words Sensei added at the end, "for my wife's sake," strangely warmed my heart. Because of them, I was able to sleep peacefully that night. I didn't forget those words, "for my wife's sake," for a long time afterward. It was clear, even from this, that the disturbance between Sensei and his wife hadn't been a serious one. And from the many times I visited their home afterward, I could also tell that such things were rare occurrences between them. More than that, Sensei once even confided the following sentiment to me. "In this world, I've only ever truly known one woman, my wife. Other women hardly affect me as women at all, and she, in turn, sees me as the only man in the world. In that sense, we ought to be the most fortunate couple alive." I've forgotten the circumstances of that conversation, why Sensei told me such a thing, but I still remember his serious demeanor and subdued tone. What struck me most strangely at the time was his final phrase, "We ought to be the most fortunate couple alive." Why didn't he simply say that they were happy? That subtle phrasing, and especially the weight he seemed to put on those words, left me puzzled. Was Sensei truly happy? Or, though he ought to have been, was he somehow not? I couldn't help but wonder. And yet, that suspicion was buried somewhere in my mind for the time being. Not long after, I had the chance to visit Sensei's home while he was out and speak with his wife alone. That day, Sensei had gone to Shimbashi Station to see off a friend who was setting sail from Yokohama for overseas. At the time, it was customary for those departing from Yokohama to take the 8:30 a.m. train from Shimbashi. I had something I needed to discuss with Sensei regarding a book, and since I'd already gotten his permission, I arrived at the appointed time of 9 o'clock. His going to Shimbashi had been a sudden decision, an act of courtesy for the friend who had come to bid farewell the previous day. Sensei had told me he'd be back soon, and that I should wait even if he wasn't there. So I entered the sitting room and talked with his wife while waiting. Chapter 11. At that time, I was already a university student. Compared to when I had first visited Sensei's house, I felt much more grown up. It was after I had become quite close to his wife. I no longer felt any unease speaking with her. We had many conversations face to face. However, they were ordinary chats without any particular features, so I have completely forgotten them now. Among them, there was only one thing that stuck in my memory. But before I recount that, there is something I must clarify. Sensei was a university graduate. I had known that from the beginning. However, it was only after I returned to Tokyo and some time had passed that I learned he spent his days doing nothing. I wondered how he could live like that. Sensei was a man entirely unknown to the public. Therefore, apart from me, who had a close relationship with him, there was no one else who would show any respect for his learning or thought. I often said that was a shame. Sensei would only reply, "A man like me has no business speaking out in the world," and would dismiss the matter. His answer sounded so excessively humble to me that it seemed almost as if he were criticizing the world. In fact, he would occasionally make harsh and candid remarks about some of his former classmates who had since become well known. I would then bluntly point out this contradiction and make various comments. My attitude was not so much rebellious as it was a frustration that the world could remain indifferent to someone like Sensei. At that time, Sensei said in a quiet tone, "It's no use. I am not qualified to present myself to the world." His face bore a deep and vivid expression. I could not tell whether it was disappointment, resentment, or sorrow, but it was something so powerful I found myself unable to say another word. One day, while I was talking with his wife, the topic naturally drifted toward Sensei. Why does Sensei spend his time just thinking or studying at home, without going out into the world to work? I asked. He's no good for that sort of thing. He doesn't like it. Do you mean he has come to see it as trivial or meaningless? I'm just a woman, so I don't really understand such things. But I don't think that's quite it. He probably does want to do something, but he just can't. That's why it's so sad. But Sensei seems perfectly healthy. There's nothing wrong with him physically, is there? He's perfectly healthy. He has no chronic illness. Then why can't he be active? That's what I don't understand either. If I could understand that, I wouldn't worry so much. It's because I don't understand it that I feel so sorry for him. There was deep sympathy in her tone, yet a faint smile remained on her lips. From the outside, I may have seemed the more serious of the two. I sat in silence with a troubled look. Then, as if suddenly remembering something, she spoke again. He wasn't always like this when he was young. He used to be completely different. He changed completely. When was that? I asked. During his student days. You knew Sensei back when he was a student? Her face turned slightly red. Chapter 12. She was from Tokyo. I had heard that from both her and Sensei before. She once said jokingly, "To tell the truth, I'm a mixed child." Her father was apparently from Tottori or somewhere around there, while her mother was born in Ichigaya back when the area was still called Edo. That's why she spoke that way half in jest. On the other hand, Sensei was entirely from a different region. He was from Niigata. So if she had known him during his student days, it clearly wasn't due to some hometown connection. However, seeing her flushed face, it was clear she didn't want to go into it further, so I refrained from pressing her. From the time I became acquainted with Sensei until his death, I came into contact with his thoughts and feelings through many different topics, but I was never able to learn much about the circumstances of his marriage. Sometimes I interpreted that generously. I thought that perhaps, being older, he deliberately refrained from telling romantic stories to someone younger like me. At other times, I saw it less favorably. Perhaps neither Sensei nor his wife had the courage to openly share that kind of emotional story because they had grown up under the conventions of a different era. Either way, it was only speculation. And behind both of my theories was the assumption that there must be some beautiful romance buried in the background of their marriage. That assumption turned out not to be wrong, but I had only imagined the romantic half of the story. In reality, Sensei harbored a terrible tragedy behind that beautiful love. What's more, his wife had no idea how miserable that tragedy had made him. Even now, she still doesn't know. Sensei kept it hidden from her until his death. Before destroying her happiness, he destroyed his own life first. I will not speak now of that tragedy. As I mentioned earlier, the love between the two was, in a way, born out of that very tragedy. Yet neither of them ever spoke to me about it. The wife out of modesty, and Sensei for an even deeper reason. There is just one thing I remember. One spring, during cherry blossom season, I went to Ueno with Sensei. There, we saw a beautiful couple, a young man and woman. They were walking closely side by side beneath the blossoms. Because of the place, many people seemed more interested in watching the couple than the flowers. They look like newlyweds, Sensei said. They seem to be very much in love, I replied. Sensei didn't even smile. He turned away and walked in a direction that led them out of his sight. Then he asked me, "Have you ever been in love?" "No," I replied. "Would you like to be?" I didn't answer. You do not want to, do you? No. When you saw that couple just now, you mocked them in your heart, didn't you? That scorn you felt probably came from your frustration, desiring love, but having no one to share it with. Did it sound like that to you? It did. Someone who is truly fulfilled by love speaks in warmer tones. But listen, love is a sin. Do you understand that? I was taken aback and said nothing. Chapter 13. We were in the middle of a crowd. Everyone around us looked cheerful, until we passed through them and entered the quiet woods where flowers and people could no longer be seen. There was no opportunity to speak again on the same topic. Is love a sin? I suddenly asked. Yes, it is. Absolutely. Sensei replied with the same forceful tone as before. Why? You'll understand eventually. No, you probably already understand. Your heart has long been stirred by love, hasn't it? I searched within myself, but, to my surprise, I found only emptiness. Nothing came to mind. There's nothing specific in my heart. I don't believe I'm hiding anything from you. It's because there's no object that your heart stirs. If there were, you might settle. But in its absence, you are restless. I'm not that restless right now. But it was your restlessness that led you to me, wasn't it? That may be true, but that's different from love. It's a step toward love. As a stage toward embracing the opposite sex, you first sought out someone of the same sex, me. To me, those two things seem completely different. No, they're the same. As a man, I am fundamentally incapable of satisfying you. And, due to certain circumstances, I'm even less able to satisfy you. I genuinely feel sorry for you. I can't blame you if you move away from me. In fact, I hope you do. But a strange sadness welled up in me. If you think I'll leave you, I can't help that. But I've never once had such a thought. Sensei didn't respond to my words. Still, you must be careful. Love is a sin. You won't find satisfaction here, but you also won't find danger. Do you know what it feels like to be bound by long, black hair? I had imagined it, but never experienced it. In any case, I didn't fully understand what he meant by calling love a sin, and I was starting to feel a little irritated. Sensei, please explain more clearly what you mean by sin. If not, then let's end this topic here, until I can clearly understand what you mean. I've done wrong. I thought I was speaking to you honestly, but really, I was just teasing you. That was wrong of me. Sensei and I walked at a quiet pace from behind the museum toward Ugwasadani. Through the gaps in the fence, I could see clusters of dwarf bamboo growing in the garden, tranquil and secluded. Do you know why I visit the grave of a friend buried in Zashigaya every month? The question was sudden, but Sensei knew full well I could not answer. I stayed silent. Then, as if realizing it for the first time, he added, "Another wrong." I try to explain, thinking it's better than teasing, but the explanation ends up teasing you again. It's hopeless. Let's stop this topic here. In any case, love is a sin. Do you understand? And also, it is sacred. Sensei's words only confused me more. After that, he never spoke of love again. Chapter 14. As a young man, I was somewhat prone to becoming overly single-minded. At least, that's how it seemed in the eyes of Sensei. To me, Sensei's conversations were more valuable than my school lectures. His ideas were more precious to me than the opinions of my professors. In the end, to put it plainly, Sensei, who lived quietly and spoke little, appeared greater to me than the eminent men who stood on the podium and guided me. "You mustn't get too carried away," Sensei said. "I feel this way after much thought," I replied, fully confident in what I said. But Sensei did not accept that confidence. You are feverish with emotion. Once that fever subsides, you will grow disillusioned. It pains me that you think so highly of me now. But when I consider the changes that are bound to occur in you in the future, it pains me even more. Do you think I'm that frivolous? That untrustworthy? I only feel sorry for you. You feel sorry for me, but you still won't trust me. Sensei looked troubled and turned his gaze toward the garden. The camellias that had recently dotted the space with their heavy, vivid red blooms were now entirely gone. Sensei often gazed out at those flowers from the drawing room. When I say I don't trust, I don't mean I don't trust you in particular. I don't trust people as a whole. At that moment, a voice, likely that of a goldfish seller, called out from beyond the hedge. Other than that, there was nothing to be heard. The narrow lane, tucked away 2 blocks from the main road, was surprisingly quiet. Inside the house, everything was as still as always. I knew that Sensei's wife was in the next room. I also knew that my voice could be heard as she sat there quietly, working with her needle or something of the sort. But I had completely forgotten about her. Then, do you not trust your wife either? I asked. Sensei's face showed a hint of unease. He avoided giving a direct answer. I don't even trust myself. In other words, I can't trust others because I can't trust myself. I have no choice but to curse myself. If you think that deeply, then no one could believe in anything with certainty. No, it's not that I thought too deeply. I did something. After doing it, I was shocked. And then, I became terribly afraid. I wanted to follow the same path of thought a little further. Just then, from behind the sliding door, came his wife's voice. Dear, dear. Twice she called. On the second time, Sensei replied, What is it? She said, Just a moment, and called him into the next room. I had no idea what matter had come up between them, but before I had time to imagine, Sensei had already returned to the room. In any case, don't trust me too much. You'll regret it later, and that regret will turn into a cruel desire for revenge at having been deceived. What do you mean by that? The memory of once kneeling at someone's feet turns into the urge to trample them underfoot. I would rather reject the respect you show me now than suffer such humiliation in the future. I choose to endure the loneliness of the present, instead of the lonelier self I might become in the future. We who were born in this era, filled with freedom, independence, and selfhood, must all taste this loneliness as the cost of it. Before such resolve, I could find no words to say to Sensei. Chapter 15. After that, every time I saw the wife's face, I couldn't help but wonder, did the professor always treat her like this too? And if he did, was she satisfied with it? I couldn't say whether she seemed content or not. I didn't have many opportunities to be that close to her, and whenever I did see her, she always acted normally. On top of that, we hardly ever saw each other unless the professor was present. My doubts ran even deeper. Where did this resolution of the professor's toward others come from? Was it simply the result of looking coldly into himself and observing the modern world with a critical eye? He was someone who spent a lot of time sitting and thinking. With that kind of mind, perhaps such an attitude could naturally form while reflecting on life. But I didn't think that was the whole story. His resolve seemed to be born from something lived. It wasn't like the outline of a stone building, scorched by fire and completely cooled. The professor who appeared before me was certainly a thinker, but beneath the principles he constructed, there seemed to be some powerful truth woven in. Not truths experienced by others and kept at arm's length, but truths he had personally and painfully endured. Realities that made the blood run hot or stopped the pulse altogether. This wasn't just speculation on my part. The professor had already confessed as much himself. But his confession was like a mountain peak shrouded in clouds. It loomed above my head, covering me in something terrifying, and I didn't even understand what was so terrifying about it. The confession was vague, and yet it clearly sent tremors through my nerves. In trying to understand the foundation of his view of life, I imagined that there must have been a powerful love affair at its core, naturally, between him and his wife. His comment that love is a sin gave me a small clue in this direction. However, he had also told me that he still loved his wife. If their love was mutual, how could it have led to this almost misanthropic resolve? The professor had once said, "The memory of kneeling before someone can later drive you to step on their head." That might apply to people in general, but it didn't seem to fit the relationship between him and his wife. Then there was the grave in Zashigaya, that nameless grave. I recalled it now and then. I knew it had a deep connection to the professor. Though I was drawing closer to his life, I still couldn't get close enough to understand it. So I accepted the grave into my mind as a fragment of life held in the professor's mind. But to me, it was a lifeless thing. It didn't serve as a key to open the door between the professor and his wife. If anything, it stood between them like a demon blocking the free passage of feeling. And so it happened that I again found myself needing to speak with the wife face to face. It was during that hurried, shortening season of autumn, when the chill in the air made everyone more aware of their surroundings. Several thefts had occurred in the neighborhood over the course of 3 or 4 evenings. They all happened early in the night. No household lost anything of great value, but in every case, something was taken. The wife was unsettled. Just then, one evening, the professor had a reason to leave the house. A friend from his hometown, now working at a hospital in the provinces, had come to Tokyo, and the professor, along with 2 or 3 others, had to take him out to dinner. The professor explained the situation and asked if I would mind staying at the house while he was gone. I readily agreed. Chapter 16. I arrived just at dusk, when the lights were about to come on, but the punctual professor had already left. He said he didn't want to be late, and he just stepped out. The wife said, showing me into his study. The study contained a Western-style desk and chair, and books with beautiful bindings lined up behind glass, lit by the electric light. The wife had me sit on a cushion in front of the brazier. "Feel free to read something from around here," she said before leaving. I felt like a guest waiting for the host to return, which made me uneasy. I sat stiffly and smoked a cigarette. I could hear the wife talking with the maid in the sitting room. The study was at a corner beyond the veranda and more removed than the guest rooms, and so it was quite peaceful. When the wife's voice fell silent, all was still. I sat quietly, like someone waiting for a thief, alert to every sound. About 30 minutes later, the wife peeked into the room. "Oh," she said, surprised, and gave me a look. Then she smiled as if amused by how proper I looked, sitting stiffly like a guest. "You must be uncomfortable." "No, not at all." "But you must be bored." "Not at all. I'm on edge thinking a thief might come, so I'm not bored." The wife stood there with a teacup in her hand, laughing. "This corner of the house isn't great for keeping watch," I said. "Well then, if you don't mind, why don't you come to the middle of the house? I brought some tea thinking you might be bored. We can have it in the sitting room." I followed her out of the study. In the sitting room, a pretty long brazier was heating a kettle that sang as it boiled. The wife served me tea and sweets. She didn't touch her cup, saying she might not sleep if she drank it. "Does the professor often go out to gatherings like this?" "Hardly ever. Lately, he seems to dislike seeing people more and more." She didn't seem especially troubled by this. That gave me the courage to speak more boldly. "So you're the only exception?" "No, I'm one of the people he dislikes too." "That's not true," I said. "You're saying that knowing it isn't." "Why? Because from where I stand, he's grown to dislike the world because he loved you. You're quite the scholar. I see. You handle abstract arguments well. But couldn't it also be the reverse? That he grew to dislike me because he came to hate the world? That's just as logical. You're quite the scholar. I see. You handle abstract arguments well. But couldn't it also be the reverse? That he grew to dislike me because he came to hate the world? That's just as logical. Both could be argued. But in this case, I believe I'm right. I don't want to debate. Men love debating, don't they? Like pouring empty cups back and forth and never getting tired of it. Her words stung a little, but they didn't sound harsh. She didn't seem like the type to pride herself on outsmarting someone. Instead, she appeared to hold something deeper within her as more important. Chapter 17. There was more I wanted to say, but I didn't want to come off as just another man trying to start an argument. I held back. You've gone awfully quiet, the wife said, peeking into her teacup. I'm afraid of getting scolded for starting another argument, I replied. I wouldn't scold you for that. We started talking again, taking up our shared interest, the professor. May I say one more thing about earlier? You might think it's just theory, but I'm being sincere. Go ahead. If you were suddenly gone, do you think the professor could go on living as he does now? That's not something I can answer. You'd have to ask him. No, this is a question for you. Please answer honestly. I'm being honest. I really don't know. Then, how much do you love him? That's a question for you, not him. You don't have to ask that so seriously. Then you're saying the answer is obvious? Well, yes. If that's how loyal you are to him, what would happen if you were gone? He doesn't seem to find joy in anything else. If you disappeared, would he be happy or miserable? From my perspective, I know the answer, though the professor may not feel the same. If I left him, he'd only be unhappy. Maybe he couldn't go on living. That might sound conceited, but I truly believe I'm making him as happy as he can be. I even think no one else could do it like I do. That's why I can stay calm. That faith must be visible to the professor too. That's a different matter. You still say he dislikes you? No, not that. He doesn't dislike me. He can't. But I think he's grown to dislike people altogether. And if I'm just one of those people, he can't like me either. Finally, I understood what she meant by being disliked. Chapter 18. I was impressed by the wife's powers of understanding. The fact that her demeanor wasn't that of an old-fashioned Japanese woman also stirred something in me. And yet, at the same time, she almost never used the so-called modern expressions that were just beginning to become fashionable back then. I was a naive young man, with no deep experience in relationships with women. As a man, driven by instinct toward the opposite sex, I constantly dreamed of women as objects of yearning. But it was like gazing up at soft spring clouds, vague and wistful. That's all it was. So when I actually came face to face with a real woman, my feelings sometimes changed in an instant. Instead of being drawn in, I occasionally felt an odd sense of repulsion. But I never had that reaction with the wife. The idea of a difference in thought between men and women, which often comes between them, barely occurred to me. I forgot that she was a woman. I simply looked at her as the critic and sympathizer of the sincere man I admired, Sensei. Ma'am, do you remember when I asked you the other day why Sensei doesn't engage more actively with society? And you said that he wasn't always like this. Yes, I remember, because he truly wasn't always like this. What was he like then? He was someone we could both rely on, you and I, someone we could believe in. Then what made him change so drastically? It wasn't sudden. Gradually, over time, he became like this. You were always with him during that period, weren't you? Of course, we're husband and wife. Then surely you must know what caused the change. That's exactly the problem. It's painful to admit it when you put it that way, but no matter how I think about it, I can't come up with an answer. I don't know how many times I've begged him, please, just tell me the truth. What does Sensei say? He just says there's nothing to tell, nothing to worry about, that he simply became the kind of person he is now. He won't discuss it. I stayed silent. She, too, let the conversation drop. Even the maid in the back room didn't make a sound. I had completely forgotten about the burglar by then. Do you think this is my fault? She suddenly asked. No, I answered. Please, be honest. Hiding it would be more painful than a knife to the chest. I've done everything I can for him. At least, that's what I believe. Sensei acknowledges that too. Don't worry, I can vouch for it. She stirred the ash in the brazier and then poured water from the pitcher into the iron kettle. The kettle quickly quieted its simmering. In the end, I couldn't bear it any longer and asked him, if I've done anything wrong, please tell me. If it's something I can fix, I will. But he only said, you have no faults. The fault lies entirely with me. When he said that, it only made me more sad. I cried, and that made me want to know my faults even more. Her eyes welled up with tears. Chapter 19. At first, I regarded the wife as a woman of understanding. But as I continued talking to her in that spirit, she gradually began to change. Instead of appealing to my mind, she began to move my heart. She said that there should be no ill will between her and her husband, and yet there was something. But when she opened her eyes to try and see what it was, she found nothing. That was the crux of what troubled her. She had initially declared that Sensei had grown weary of the world, and that this was the reason he had come to dislike her as well. But she couldn't settle on that conclusion. Digging deeper, she started to think the reverse might be true, that Sensei had grown tired of the world because he had come to dislike her. But no matter how she tried to confirm that, she couldn't prove it true. Sensei's manner remained kind and caring. His behavior was exactly what one would expect from a loving husband. Every day, he wrapped the growing doubt she harbored with gentleness and kindness and tucked it away deep in her heart. That night, in front of me, she unwrapped it and laid it bare. What do you think? She asked. Did it start with me? Or was it something to do with what you call his view of life or whatever? Please, don't hide anything. I had no intention of hiding anything. But if something unknown to me was at the root of it all, then whatever I said would never satisfy her. And I believe there was something I didn't know. I don't know. She gave a sorrowful expression, as if my answer had defied all her expectations. I quickly added, but I can say that Sensei does not dislike you. I'm only telling you what he told me. And Sensei is not the kind of person to lie, is he? She didn't respond. After a while, she spoke. Actually, there's one thing that might be related. Related to why he became like this. Yes, if it is the cause, then it wouldn't be my fault. That would be a great relief, but... What is it? She hesitated, looking down at her hands folded on her lap. Please, judge for yourself. I'll tell you. If it's something I can judge, I will. I can't tell you everything. If I did, he'd scold me. I'll just tell you what won't get me in trouble. I swallowed hard, tense. When Sensei was still at university, he had a very close friend. That friend died suddenly, just before graduating. She lowered her voice to a near whisper. It was an unnatural death, she said. It was said in a way that demanded the question, how? That's all I can say. But it was after that he started to change. I don't know why that friend died. Maybe even Sensei doesn't know. But when I think of it as the cause of his change, it does make a certain kind of sense. Is that the person buried in Zashigaya? I'm not supposed to say, so I won't. But can someone really change so completely, just because they lost one friend? That's what I want to know. That's what I want you to help me judge. My judgment leaned toward the negative. Chapter 20. I tried my best to comfort the wife, within the limits of what I understood. She, too, seemed eager to find solace in whatever I could offer. So we talked about the same topic again and again. But in truth, I had no grasp of the matter's root. The wife's unease, too, stemmed from a vague cloud of doubt. As for the actual facts, even she didn't know much. And even what she did know, she couldn't fully tell me. So both the one offering comfort and the one seeking it drifted like two leaves upon the waves. And yet, she continued to reach out toward me, trying to cling to my uncertain judgment. Around 10 o'clock, we heard the sound of Sensei's shoes at the front door. The wife immediately stood up, almost forgetting everything that had just passed between us, and went to greet him as he opened the lattice door, almost face to face. I followed her, left behind a little. The maid, it seemed, had dozed off and never appeared. Sensei seemed in a good mood, but his wife's mood was even better. I still remembered the tears that had welled in her beautiful eyes earlier, and the sorrow etched between her brows. The change now struck me as unusually abrupt. If it wasn't a performance, and it didn't seem to be, then all the emotion she had just shown me might be dismissed as a woman's idle game, played with me for sentiment's sake. But I didn't feel inclined to view her that critically. If anything, I was relieved by her brightened demeanor. I began to think that maybe I had been overconcerned. Sensei laughed and said, "Thanks for your trouble. Did the thief come?" Then he added, "Bit of a letdown, isn't it, that he didn't show?" As I left, the wife bowed and said, "So sorry to have kept you." But the way she said it, it sounded more like, "Sorry the thief didn't come and make it worth your while," rather than an apology for making me waste my time. She handed me the leftover Western sweets from earlier, wrapped in paper. I put them in my sleeve and hurried through the quiet, chilly alleyway toward the busy part of town. I've written out the details of that night here because they're worth recording. But to be honest, when I went home that evening, sweets in hand, I didn't take the conversation very seriously. The next day, after returning from school for lunch, I spotted the package of sweets on my desk, took out the brown sponge cake coated with chocolate, and began eating it. And as I tasted it, I thought to myself that the couple who had given it to me must be, after all, a happy pair. Nothing particularly noteworthy happened between the end of autumn and the beginning of winter. Whenever I visited Sensei's house, I began asking the wife for help with things like mending and tailoring my clothes. That was when I first started wearing a black collared garment over my shirt, something I'd never worn before. The childless wife seemed to enjoy looking after such things, if only as a way to pass the time, and even said it was good for her health. This is hand-woven, isn't it? I've never sewn fabric this nice before, but it's so hard to work with. The needle won't go through it all. I broke 2 needles already, she complained, but even then, she didn't seem particularly annoyed. Chapter 21. When winter came, I happened to be called back home. In a letter from my mother, she described my father's condition as not progressing well. Though there was no immediate danger, she added that since he was of advanced age, it would be best if I could arrange to return home. My father had long suffered from a kidney disease. As is often the case with middle-aged individuals, his illness was chronic. Because of this, as long as he took care, both he and the family believed there was no risk of a sudden change. In fact, he often told visitors that, thanks to his careful regimen, he had managed to get by so far. According to my mother's letter, one day while doing something in the garden, he suddenly grew dizzy and collapsed. The family, mistaking it for a mild stroke, gave immediate treatment accordingly. Later, the doctor suggested it was likely not a stroke, but a result of his chronic kidney condition. Only then did the family begin to consider the connection between the collapse and the kidney disease. Winter break had not yet arrived, and I thought there would be no harm in waiting until the end of the term, so I delayed for a day or two. But during those couple of days, I kept seeing images of my father lying in bed and my mother's worried face. Each time, I felt a pang of guilt and finally made up my mind to return. To save the time and trouble of asking my family to send travel expenses, I decided to visit Sensei to both say goodbye and ask him to lend me the necessary money. Sensei had caught a slight cold and said he didn't feel like coming out to the parlor, so he received me in his study. Through the glass doors, a rare, warm winter sunlight was shining gently across the desk cover. Sensei had placed a large brazier in the room, and the steam rising from a metal basin placed on a trivet helped keep the air from becoming too dry and harsh. A serious illness is one thing, but these minor colds are actually more unpleasant, Sensei said, looking at me with a wry smile. Sensei had never suffered any significant illness. Hearing his comment, I felt like laughing. I don't mind colds, but anything worse would be too much for me. I bet you'd feel the same. You'd understand if you tried it once. Is that so? If I had to fall ill, I'd rather it be a fatal one. I didn't pay much attention to his words and instead went straight into explaining my mother's letter and asking for a loan. That must be hard. I think I have that amount on hand, so take it. Sensei called his wife and had her bring out the money and place it before me. She brought it from a drawer, carefully arranged it on a white sheet of paper, and said, "That's very worrisome, isn't it?" Did he collapse more than once? Sensei asked. The letter doesn't mention it. Is it common to collapse repeatedly like that? Yes. That's when I learned for the first time that Sensei's wife's mother had died of the same disease as my father. It must be serious then, I said. Yes, I wish I could take his place, if that were possible. Has he had any nausea? I'm not sure. The letter didn't mention it, so probably not. As long as there's no nausea, it's still all right, his wife said. That night, I took the train to leave Tokyo. Chapter 22. My father's condition wasn't as bad as I had feared. When I arrived, he sat cross-legged in bed and said, "Everyone's worried, so I'm humoring them by lying still like this. Really, I could get up any time." But the next day, despite my mother's objections, he insisted on getting up. Folding up the thick quilt reluctantly, my mother said, "Your father suddenly got spirited when you came home." But to me, he didn't seem to be putting on a show of strength. My elder brother held a job in distant Kyushu and couldn't easily leave his duties. My sister was married off to another province and couldn't come on short notice either. Among the three siblings, I, a student, was the most readily available. That I had returned home early, leaving school at my mother's request, brought my father great satisfaction. "It's a pity to make you miss school over such a minor illness," your mother wrote an overly dramatic letter. He said, not only in words, but also by raising his bedding and showing signs of energy as if nothing were wrong. "If you overdo it and suffer a relapse, that'd be bad," I warned. He took it lightly and cheerfully. "No, I'll be fine, as long as I continue being careful like always." Indeed, he seemed to be all right. He moved about the house freely, without losing breath or getting dizzy. His complexion was poor, but that had always been the case, and we didn't think much of it. I wrote a letter to Sensei thanking him for the loan and explaining that I would return the money when I came back to Tokyo for the new year. I also reported that my father's condition wasn't as serious as we had thought, that he was stable for now, and that there were no signs of dizziness or nausea. At the end, I added a brief note of concern about Sensei's cold, which I had honestly regarded as trivial. When I sent the letter, I had no expectation of receiving a reply. Later, while chatting with my parents about Sensei, I imagined his study from afar. Bring him some shiitake mushrooms when you go back to Tokyo. Sure, but I wonder if Sensei even eats dried mushrooms. They're not delicious, but I don't think anyone really dislikes them. To me, linking mushrooms with Sensei felt oddly mismatched. When I did receive a reply from Sensei, I was quite surprised, especially since it contained nothing of particular importance. I felt he had written back out of sheer kindness, and that alone made me very happy. After all, it was the first letter I had ever received from him. To say first might suggest we exchanged many letters, but in fact, I only received 2 letters from Sensei in his lifetime. One was this simple response, and the other was a very long letter he wrote to me just before his death. Because of the nature of his illness, my father had to refrain from physical exertion, so even after getting up from bed, he rarely went outside. On one mild afternoon, he stepped into the garden, but I stayed close by his side in case anything happened. When I tried to let him rest his hand on my shoulder out of concern, he only laughed and declined. Chapter 23. I often played shogi with my father to help him pass the time. Both of us being rather lazy, we stayed under the kotatsu and placed the board on the frame, drawing our hands out from under the covers only to move the pieces. Sometimes, we lost a piece and didn't realize it until the next match. Then my mother would find it in the ashes and fish it out with tongs, a funny little scene. You can't play Go on the kotatsu because the board's too tall and has legs, but shogi is great. You can play comfortably like this. It's perfect for lazy folks. Let's play another round. My father always said, one more round, whether he won or lost. In short, he simply enjoyed sitting under the kotatsu and playing shogi. At first, this leisurely amusement interested me too, but after a while, it wasn't enough to satisfy my youthful energy. I would stretch my arm holding a gold or lance piece over my head and yawn deeply. I thought of Tokyo. I felt the pulse of my surging blood echoing in my chest, filled with the desire to move and act. Strangely, it felt as though that pulse was being strengthened by Sensei's influence. I compared my father and Sensei in my mind. Both were quiet, almost to the point where one might wonder whether they were truly alive. In terms of social recognition, they were equally insignificant. And yet, this father who liked to play shogi for amusement did not fulfill me, even as a companion. Sensei, who had never visited me for fun or leisure, exerted a deeper influence on my thoughts. No, more than thoughts, on my very being. His presence seemed to penetrate my flesh, to flow through my blood. It was not an exaggeration to say so at the time. I tried to reconcile the plain truth that my father was my real father, while Sensei was a complete stranger, and yet, I was struck as if I had discovered some profound truth. As I began to grow restless, my parents gradually began to treat me more casually, as if I were no longer a novelty. I suppose this is something everyone returning home for holidays experiences. At first, you're treated with great care and enthusiasm, but once the novelty wears off, the family cools and begins treating you as if your presence is neither here nor there. I, too, had passed that peak during my stay. On top of that, every time I came back from Tokyo, I brought with me something unrecognizable to my father and mother. It was like bringing the scent of Christianity into a Confucian household. What I brought back never quite fit in. Of course, I kept it hidden, but since it was a part of me, it inevitably surfaced and caught their attention. I grew uneasy and wanted to return to Tokyo as soon as possible. Fortunately, my father's condition remained stable, with no signs of worsening. To be thorough, we even brought a reputable doctor from afar, but he found nothing beyond what we already knew. I decided to leave a little before the end of winter break. When I announced it, both my parents opposed it. Human emotions are strange that way. Already? Isn't it a little early? My mother asked. You still have 4 or 5 days, don't you? Said my father. But I stuck to the departure date I had decided upon. Chapter 24. When I returned to Tokyo, the New Year's decorations had already been taken down. The town, left to the mercy of the cold wind, showed no real signs of festive spirit anywhere. I immediately went to return the money to Sensei. I brought along the usual shiitake mushrooms as well. Since it would have been odd to hand them over without explanation, I told his wife, "My mother asked me to give these to you," and placed them before her. The mushrooms were packed in a new confectionery box. As she thanked me politely and carried the box into the next room, she was surprised at how light it was and asked, "What kind of sweets are these?" Once she became familiar with someone, she would often show this kind of childlike candor in small ways. Both Sensei and his wife asked many concerned questions about my father's illness. At one point, Sensei said, "From what I hear, it doesn't seem too serious at the moment, but because of the nature of the illness, you must be very careful." Sensei knew a great deal about kidney disease, much more than I did. The defining trait of that disease is that people often don't notice they have it. They go about as usual, completely unaware. I knew an officer who died from it. His death was so sudden, it seemed unreal. His wife didn't even have time to care for him. He woke her in the middle of the night saying he felt ill, and by the next morning, he was dead. She said she thought he was just sleeping. My previously optimistic attitude gave way to sudden anxiety. Could my father end up like that too? There's no saying he won't. What did the doctor say? The doctor says he's beyond recovery, but he also says there's no immediate danger. In that case, that's good, if the doctor says so. What I mentioned just now was someone who didn't notice anything was wrong, and he was a rather rough military man. I felt somewhat reassured. Sensei, watching me closely, added, "But whether in health or illness, human beings are fragile. You never know when or how you might die." Do you think about such things too, Sensei? Even someone as healthy as I am can't help thinking about it sometimes. There was a faint smile on Sensei's lips. There are people who die suddenly, just like that, naturally, and others who die in a flash, through unnatural violence. What do you mean by unnatural violence? I'm not entirely sure myself, but those who take their own lives, they all must be using some form of unnatural violence. Then being killed is also a result of such violence, isn't it? The person who gets killed wasn't thinking about it at all. Yes, I suppose you could say that. That day, I went home. Even after returning, I didn't feel too weighed down by my father's illness. Sensei's talk of dying naturally or by unnatural violence left only a faint impression and no lingering concern in my mind. What occupied me now was the graduation thesis that I had often tried to begin but always put off. I finally felt I had to get serious and start writing it. Chapter 25. I was scheduled to graduate that June, so I had to finish my thesis properly by the end of April. Counting the remaining days on my fingers, February, March, April, I began to doubt my own nerve. Others had been gathering materials and filling notebooks well in advance, and they all looked quite busy. I, on the other hand, hadn't even begun. All I had was the resolution to start seriously once the new year began. With that in mind, I finally began. But almost immediately, I was stuck. I had thought I had the main structure all worked out, with the major points clearly outlined in my mind, but now I sat holding my head, deeply troubled. I decided to scale down my topic. To avoid the trouble of organizing my ideas into a coherent system, I chose to simply list the information from books and add a modest conclusion. The topic I chose was closely related to the teacher's field. When I once asked for his opinion on my choice, he said, "It's fine." In a bit of a panic, I went to his place to ask for references. He kindly shared his knowledge and offered to lend me 2 or 3 books, but he showed no intention of guiding me further. "I haven't read much lately, so I don't know anything new. You'd better ask your professors at school." I had once heard from his wife that the teacher used to be an avid reader, but for some reason, he'd lost interest in reading. I remembered that now and asked him on a whim, "Why don't you enjoy reading anymore, the way you used to?" "There's no particular reason. Maybe it's because I feel that no matter how much you read, you don't really become wiser. Also, there's more." Not really a proper reason, but in the past, I'd feel embarrassed if I didn't know something when talking to others. Lately, though, I've stopped seeing ignorance as such a shameful thing. So I guess I've lost the energy to force myself to read. To put it simply, I've grown old. The teacher's words were calm and lacking any bitterness. That's why I didn't feel much impact. I didn't think he had grown old, nor did I find him especially admirable. I went home without any particular impression. After that, I struggled like a man possessed, my eyes red from strain. I asked several friends who had graduated the year before about their experiences. One of them said he rushed to the office on the final day by rickshaw, barely making it in time. Another said he was about 15 minutes late and almost had his paper rejected, but the department head kindly accepted it. I felt both nervous and determined. Every day, I worked at my desk to the limits of my strength. When I wasn't at home, I was in the dim archives, scanning the tall bookshelves. My eyes searched the spines for golden letters like an antique collector digging for treasures. As the plum blossoms bloomed, the cold wind gradually shifted direction. Soon, rumors of cherry blossoms began to reach my ears. Still, I moved forward like a workhorse, driven by my thesis. I didn't step over the teacher's threshold again until the end of April, when I finally completed my paper as planned. Chapter 26. I was finally free in early summer, when the late-blooming cherry blossoms had scattered and fresh green leaves began to softly blur the branches. I felt like a bird escaping its cage, spreading its wings and gazing over the vast world. The first thing I did was go to the teacher's house. The Karatachi hedge had fresh green buds bursting from the blackened branches, and shiny brown leaves sprouted from the dead wood of the pomegranate tree, reflecting the sunlight softly. Everything caught my eye. I felt as if I were seeing it all for the first time in my life. The teacher, noticing my bright expression, said, "So your thesis is done? That's wonderful." I replied, "Yes, thanks to you, I've finally finished. I have nothing left to do now." At that moment, I felt like I had completed all the work life demanded of me, and that from now on, I could proudly enjoy myself. I was full of confidence and satisfaction in the thesis I had written. I eagerly explained the contents to the teacher. He responded in his usual way, "I see," or "Is that so?" but offered no further commentary. I wasn't disappointed exactly, but I felt a bit deflated. Still, I was energetic enough that day to try to pull him out of what seemed like inertia. Let's go for a walk, Sensei. It feels wonderful outside. Where to? Anywhere's fine, I said, wanting simply to take him out to the countryside. An hour later, the teacher and I left the city and wandered aimlessly through a quiet place that was neither quite village nor town. I plucked young leaves from a garden hedge and played a grass whistle. I had learned this trick from a friend from Kagoshima, and I was good at it. As I blew with pride, the teacher looked away, pretending not to notice. Soon, a path opened up under a lush, green, gently rising hill. A nameplate on the gatepost revealed it wasn't a private home. The teacher looked up the slope and said, "Shall we go in?" I answered, "It's a plant nursery." We passed through the rows of trees and came upon a house on the left. The sliding doors were open, but there was no sign of people. Only goldfish swam in a large bowl by the eaves. It's quiet. I guess it's okay if we go in without asking. I think it's fine. We walked farther in. Still no one. The azaleas were in full, fiery bloom. Pointing to a tall, reddish one, the teacher said, "That's a Kirishima azalea." There was also a field of peonies, about 10 tsubo in area, but none had bloomed yet. Beside the field, on an old bench, the teacher laid down in a large, relaxed posture. I sat at the edge, smoking. The teacher stared up at the clear blue sky. I was captivated by the fresh green leaves around us. Looking carefully, I noticed each one was a slightly different color. Even among the same maple trees, no two branches had exactly the same hue. The teacher's hat, resting atop a slender cedar sapling, was caught by the wind and fell.
Chapter 27. I immediately picked up the hat. As I flicked off the red dirt clinging here and there with my fingernail, I called out to Sensei. "Sensei, your hat fell." "Thank you." Sensei raised his body halfway and took the hat, remaining in a position that was neither quite sitting nor lying down. In that posture, he asked me something strange. "This is sudden, but does your family have a good amount of wealth?" "Not so much that you could really say so." "About how much do you have?" "Forgive me if I'm being rude." "Well, we have just a little land and rice fields. There's probably no actual money at all." It was the first time Sensei had asked me any direct question about my family's finances. As for me, I had never asked anything about Sensei's circumstances. When I first became acquainted with him, I had wondered how he could afford to spend his time in leisure. Even afterward, that doubt never left my mind. But I always held back from raising such a blunt question in front of him, thinking it too forward. While my eyes, tired from the sight of young leaves, were resting, my mind happened to return to that old curiosity. "How about you, Sensei? How much wealth do you have? Do I look like a man of means?" Sensei always dressed rather plainly. His household was small, with only a few members. Consequently, his residence was by no means large. Yet even to an outsider like me, who had never seen the inside of his home, it was clear that his life was materially well off. In short, though not luxurious, his lifestyle was not meager or tightly constrained. "I suppose not," I said. "Well, I have about that much money, but I'm certainly not wealthy. If I were, I'd build a bigger house." At that moment, Sensei sat upright, cross-legged on the bench. After saying this, he began drawing a circle in the dirt with the tip of his bamboo cane. When he finished, he stuck the cane upright in the ground like a stake. "Even I used to be from a wealthy family, you know." Sensei's words sounded half like talking to himself. Because of that, I failed to follow up right away and remained silent. I used to be from a wealthy family, you know, he repeated, this time looking at my face and smiling. I still said nothing. Rather, I was at a loss for how to respond. Then Sensei shifted the conversation. How is your father's illness these days? Since New Year's, I hadn't heard anything specific about my father's illness. The brief letters that came each month along with the money orders from home were written, as always, in his handwriting, and there was hardly any mention of his health. On top of that, his handwriting was steady. It showed none of the tremor that usually afflicts people with his kind of illness. They haven't said anything, so I guess he's doing better. If he's better, that's good, but it's a serious illness, after all. Do you still think it's hopeless? Well, maybe for now he's holding on. They haven't said anything. I see. I thought Sensei's questions about my family's wealth and my father's illness were simply part of casual conversation, an exchange of thoughts just as they came to mind. But beneath his words lay a deeper meaning that tied both topics together. Having no such experience myself, there was no way I could have realized that at the time.
Chapter 28. If your family has property, Sensei said, it would be best to settle things while you can. It's none of my business, but still, while your father is still in good health, you should make sure to receive what you're entitled to. If something happens to him, the biggest complications always come from inheritance matters. Yes. I didn't pay much attention to what Sensei was saying. Not only I, but neither my father nor mother were worried about such matters. At least, that's what I believed. I was also a bit surprised that Sensei, of all people, would say something so practical. Still, my usual respect for my elder kept me from responding. If it offends you that I'm speaking as if your father were going to die, I ask your forgiveness. But people die. No matter how healthy they seem, no one knows when their time will come. Sensei's tone was unusually bitter. I'm not bothered by that, I said, trying to defend myself. How many siblings do you have? Sensei asked. He went on to ask how many people were in my family, whether we had any relatives, and about my uncles and aunts. Then finally, he asked, are they all good people? There's no one I'd call especially bad, I suppose. Most of them are country folk. Why does being a country person mean they're not bad? I struggled with that question, but Sensei didn't give me time to think. In fact, country people are sometimes worse than city people. And you just said that none of your relatives are especially bad. But do you really believe that bad people exist as a type? There's no such thing as a mold-made villain. In everyday life, everyone seems like a decent person. At the very least, they're just ordinary. But at the critical moment, they suddenly turn into villains. That's what makes them so frightening. That's why you can never be too careful. Sensei didn't seem like he intended to stop there. I was about to say something in response when suddenly a dog began barking behind us. Startled, we both turned around. Near the back of the garden, beside the cedar saplings, a patch of dwarf bamboo grew thickly over about 3 square meters. A dog had stuck its head and back out from the bamboo and was barking fiercely. Just then, a boy of about 10 came running over and scolded the dog. Wearing a black cap with an emblem, the boy came around to the front of the porch and bowed to Sensei. Uncle, was there nobody home when you came? No, no one was there. But mother and sister were in the kitchen. Really? They were? Yeah, Uncle, you should have called out when you came. Sensei gave a wry smile, pulled out his coin purse, and placed a 5-cent coin in the boy's hand. Tell your mother this. Please let me rest here a little while. The boy gave a bright smile with intelligent eyes and nodded. I'm the scout leader right now, he declared. And with that, he ran off between the azaleas, the dog following close behind with its tail curled high. A few moments later, 2 or 3 boys of similar age came running down the same path, following the scout leader. Chapter 29. Because of the dog and the boy, Sensei's story couldn't continue to its conclusion, and I never grasped the main point. At that time, I had absolutely no concern for property or inheritance. Given my nature and situation, such worldly concerns felt far removed. Perhaps this was because I hadn't yet entered the real world, or maybe because I hadn't faced such circumstances in person, but either way, money matters still felt distant to me. What I most wanted to hear more about was Sensei's remark that anyone could become a villain in a critical moment. As a simple statement, it wasn't difficult to understand, but I wanted to know more. After the boy and the dog left, the wide garden of fresh green leaves returned to silence. We sat still for a while, like people caught in a spell of quiet. The beautiful sky gradually lost its light. The tender green maple leaves above us, which had earlier swayed like dripping drops, now seemed to grow darker. In the distance, we heard the rumble of a cart being pulled along the road. I imagined some villager taking potted plants to sell at a fair. Hearing that sound, Sensei suddenly rose as though waking from a trance. Let's head back. The days have grown longer, but still, before you know it, the evening comes. Sensei's back was covered with marks from lying on the bench. I brushed them off with both hands. Thanks. Is there any sticky sap stuck on it? It's all clean now. I just had this haori made the other day. If I come home with it all dirty, my wife will scold me. Thanks again. We returned to the house halfway up the sloping road. When we had entered earlier, no one had seemed to be home. Now, on the veranda, the lady of the house was winding thread onto a spool with a girl of about 15 or 16. We passed by a large goldfish bowl and bowed. Thank you very much for letting us impose, we said. Not at all, the lady replied. Then she thanked Sensei for the coin he had given to the boy earlier. 2 or 3 blocks after leaving the gate, I finally spoke up. Sensei, earlier you said that anyone can become a villain in a critical moment. What exactly did you mean by that? It's not so deep a meaning. It's just a fact, not theory. Fact is fine, but what I want to know is what you meant by a critical moment. What kind of situation are you talking about? Sensei laughed, as if he no longer had the enthusiasm to explain something he had already moved past. Money, my boy. When money is involved, even the most virtuous man can become a villain. I found his answer disappointingly plain. Just as he hadn't found his stride in the conversation, I felt let down. I began to walk briskly, expressionless. Sensei lagged behind. From behind, he called out, "Hey. See what I mean?" See what? Even your mood changes immediately based on a single reply of mine. He said this, looking at my face as I stopped and turned back. Chapter 30. At that moment, I felt a resentment towards Sensei deep in my heart. Even after we started walking side by side again, I deliberately refrained from asking the question I wanted to. However, Sensei either didn't notice or pretended not to. He showed no signs of being affected by my attitude. As usual, he proceeded with a composed pace, quiet and unruffled. That made me somewhat irritated. I began to feel like saying something just to get the better of him. Sensei. What is it? You were a bit excited earlier, weren't you? When we were resting in that gardener's yard. I've rarely seen you like that, so I feel like I witnessed something unusual today. Sensei didn't reply right away. I thought that perhaps my words had struck a nerve, but I also wondered if I had missed the mark. I decided not to pursue it further. Then, suddenly, Sensei stepped off to the edge of the road. He lifted his hem and relieved himself under a neatly trimmed hedge. I stood there absent-mindedly while he did so. Pardon me. With that, he resumed walking. I gave up on trying to outweed him. The road we walked along grew increasingly lively. The broad slopes and flatlands of farmland that we had seen now disappeared entirely as rows of houses appeared on both sides. Still, here and there on the edges of lots, one could see pea vines twining around bamboo poles, or chickens kept behind wire mesh, which gave a calm impression. Pack horses returning from the city passed us constantly. I, who was easily distracted by such things, completely lost sight of the question that had occupied my chest until a moment ago. When Sensei suddenly returned to the topic, I had truly forgotten about it. Did I really seem that excited earlier? Not terribly so, but a little. I don't mind if it showed. I really was excited. I always get worked up when I talk about money. I don't know how I appear to you, but I'm a very vengeful man. I never forget the humiliation or harm I've suffered, even after 10 or 20 years. Sensei's tone was even more intense than before, but what shocked me wasn't the tone. It was the meaning of the words themselves. For me, who had always respected him, to hear such a confession was completely unexpected. I had never imagined Sensei possessed such a persistent nature. I had believed him to be a weaker man, and it was in that fragile nobility that my affection for him had taken root. Having earlier tried to challenge him on a whim, I now felt small before those words. Sensei continued. I was deceived by blood relatives. They seemed to be good people in front of my father, but the moment he died, they turned into despicable scoundrels. I have carried the humiliation and damage they inflicted on me since I was a child, and I will carry it to my grave. I can never forget, and yet, I haven't sought revenge. But when I think about it, what I am doing now goes beyond personal revenge. I don't just hate them. I've come to despise humanity itself, as represented by them, and I think that's enough. I couldn't even bring myself to utter a word of consolation. Chapter 31. Our conversation ended there and didn't develop any further. I felt rather intimidated by Sensei's manner and couldn't find the will to go on. We boarded a streetcar on the outskirts of the city and hardly spoke during the ride. Soon after getting off, we had to part ways. As we did, Sensei again seemed to have changed. In a lighter tone than usual, he said, "This time between now and June is probably the most carefree period of your life. It might be the most carefree you'll ever have. Make sure to enjoy yourself." I smiled and took off my hat. At that moment, looking at his face, I wondered, does Sensei really harbor such hatred for humanity deep in his heart? His eyes, his mouth, showed no sign of the misanthropy he had spoken of. I must confess that I gained great insight into philosophical matters from Sensei, but I also have to admit that there were times when I sought understanding and could not obtain it. At times, his conversations ended unclearly. The talk we had in the suburbs that day left just such an unclear impression in my heart. Being blunt by nature, I once finally brought this up to Sensei. He laughed. I said, "It's fine if my dull head can't grasp the point, but I do wish you wouldn't keep things vague when you obviously understand." "I'm not hiding anything." "Yes, you are. You're mixing up my thoughts and opinions with my past. I'm a poor excuse for a thinker, but I don't randomly hide the ideas I've put together in my own head. There's no reason to. But if you're asking me to tell you everything about my past, that's a different matter." "I don't think it is. It's because your thoughts were born from your past that I value them. If you separate the two, they become almost worthless to me. It would be like being given a puppet with no soul. I couldn't be satisfied with that." Sensei looked at me in astonishment. The hand holding his rolled cigarette trembled slightly. "You're bold." "I'm just serious. I want to learn honestly from life." even if it means exposing my past. The word exposing struck my ears with a terrifying weight. I suddenly felt that the man sitting in front of me was not the sensei I had always respected, but a sinner. His face had gone pale. "Are you truly serious?" he pressed. "Because of my past, I've grown suspicious of others. And to be honest, I doubt you too. But somehow, I don't want to doubt you. You seem too simple to suspect. Before I die, I want to trust just one person. Can you be that one person? Will you? Are you sincere to the depths of your being? If my life is truly sincere, then so is what I've just said." My voice trembled. "Very well," said Sensei. I'll tell you. I'll tell you everything about my past. But in return, no, never mind. But it may not be all that beneficial to you. You might be better off not hearing it. And I can't tell it to you yet. Please understand that. I won't speak until the proper time comes." Even after I returned to my boarding house, I felt a kind of oppressive weight upon me. Chapter 32. It seemed that my thesis hadn't impressed the professor as much as I had hoped. Nevertheless, I graduated as scheduled. On the day of the graduation ceremony, I dug my old musty winter coat out of my trunk and put it on. Everyone at the venue looked sweltering in the heat. I felt suffocated under the thick woolen fabric that didn't let any air through. Before long, the handkerchief I was holding was drenched with sweat. As soon as the ceremony was over, I returned and stripped down. I opened the second-floor window of my boarding house and peered out at the world through the rolled-up graduation certificate, like a telescope. Then I tossed the certificate onto my desk and sprawled out in the middle of the room. As I lay there, I reflected on my past and imagined my future. Between the two, this piece of paper that marked a milestone felt at once significant and meaningless. That evening, I went to Sensei's house for dinner. It had long been agreed that if I graduated, I would have my celebratory dinner not elsewhere, but at his table. As promised, the dining table was set up near the edge of the sitting room. A thickly starched, beautifully patterned tablecloth reflected the light of the lamp with a clean brightness. Whenever I ate at Sensei's, the table was always set with white linen like you'd see in a Western-style restaurant. And it was always freshly laundered, spotless white. It's just like collars or cuffs. If you're going to use something dirty, you might as well use colored ones from the start. If it's white, it has to be pure white. When he put it that way, it made sense. Sensei was indeed a stickler for cleanliness. His study, too, was always perfectly tidy. For someone like me who was indifferent to such things, these traits stood out. When I once mentioned to his wife that Sensei seemed quite fastidious, she replied, "But he's not that particular about his clothes." Hearing this, Sensei, who was nearby, said, "To tell the truth, I'm fastidious mentally. That's why I'm always in agony. It's a ridiculous nature when you think about it," and laughed. I wasn't sure whether mentally fastidious meant he was sensitive in the popular sense, or morally exacting. It seemed his wife didn't quite understand either. That evening, I sat across from Sensei at the familiar white tablecloth. His wife sat between us, facing the garden. "Congratulations," said Sensei, raising a cup for me. But I didn't feel particularly pleased. Of course, my own heart didn't resonate with his words in any elated way. That was one reason. But Sensei's tone, too, lacked any uplifting enthusiasm. He smiled as he raised the cup, but in that smile, I detected neither malice nor genuine joy. It seemed to say, "People often say congratulations at times like this, don't they?" His wife said, "How wonderful. I'm sure your parents are delighted." That made me suddenly think of my ailing father. I felt I should hurry home and show him my graduation certificate. "What did you do with your graduation certificate, Sensei?" I asked. "What did I do with it? Is it still around somewhere?" he asked his wife. "Yes, I think it's stored away somewhere," she replied. Neither of them knew exactly where it was. Chapter 33. At mealtime, the wife dismissed the maid who sat beside her and served the food herself. This seemed to be the custom in Sensei's house for guests who were not formal visitors. At first, I felt uncomfortable, but after a few times, I became used to offering my rice bowl to her without hesitation. Tea? More rice? You really have a good appetite. Sometimes, she would boldly speak to me without reserve. But that day, perhaps due to the weather, I didn't eat enough to be teased like that. You're done already? You've been eating very little lately. I'm not eating less on purpose. It's just too hot to eat much. After calling the maid to clear the table, the wife brought out some ice cream and fruit herself. This is homemade. It seemed she had enough leisure to offer handmade ice cream to guests. I had 2 servings. Now that you've finally graduated, what are your plans? Sensei asked. He shifted halfway toward the veranda, leaning his back against the shoji at the threshold. All I was aware of was the fact that I had graduated. I had no clear idea of what I would do next. Seeing me hesitate to answer, the wife asked, "Will you be a teacher?" When I didn't reply, she asked again, "Then a government official?" Both Sensei and I laughed. To be honest, I haven't really thought about what to do. I haven't even given any serious thought to a career. I don't know what's good or bad until I try something for myself, so I'm at a loss. That may be true, but it's because you have some property that you can afford to be so carefree. If someone was in real need, they wouldn't be able to stay as calm as you. Some of my friends had been looking for teaching positions even before graduating. I acknowledged the truth of her words in my heart, but I said, "Maybe I've been influenced a little by Sensei." "You've picked up a fine influence then." Sensei gave a wry smile. "It's fine if you're influenced, but as I told you before, make sure you ask your father for a fair share of the family estate while he's still alive. Otherwise, you can't be too sure of anything." I remembered the early May day when I spoke with Sensei in the deep garden of a suburban nursery, surrounded by blooming azaleas. I recalled the passionate tone with which he had spoken as we walked back, and his strong words echoed in my ears. They were not only strong, they were grim. But since I didn't know the facts, they remained incomprehensible to me. "Ma'am, does your family have a large estate?" "Why would you ask that?" "Because Sensei won't tell me." The wife laughed and looked at Sensei's face. "Probably because there's not enough to speak of. But just tell me roughly, so I can use it as a reference when I go home and negotiate with my father." Sensei turned toward the garden and calmly puffed on his cigarette. So, I naturally had to rely on the wife. "There isn't that much. Just enough to get by like this. That aside, you really must do something. You can't spend your days idly like Sensei." "I'm not lazing around all the time." Sensei turned his head slightly and objected to her words. Chapter 34. I left Sensei's house a little past 10 that night. I was supposed to return home in a few days, so before leaving, I said a brief farewell. "I won't be seeing you again for a while. You'll come back in September, won't you?" Since I had already graduated, there was no need for me to return in September, but I hadn't planned on spending the peak of summer in Tokyo either. I didn't have any precious time to use in finding a job. Probably around September. "Well then, take care. We might go somewhere this summer ourselves. It seems it's going to be a hot one. If we do, I'll send you a postcard." "Any place in mind if you go?" Sensei was listening to this exchange with a grin. "Nothing's been decided yet, whether we go or not." As I was about to leave, Sensei suddenly asked, "By the way, how's your father's illness?" I didn't know much about my father's condition, since there had been no updates. I assumed it wasn't too serious. It's not an illness you can take lightly. If uremia sets in, it's over. I didn't understand the word uremia or what it meant. When I saw the doctor back home during winter break, I hadn't heard such medical terms. Take good care of him, the wife said. Once the poison reaches the brain, that's it. I'm not joking. I, inexperienced, felt uneasy but smiled. They say it's a terminal illness anyway, so worrying won't help. Well, if you can think about it like that, I suppose that's one way. The wife spoke in a subdued tone, perhaps remembering her mother, who had died of the same disease. She lowered her head. I truly felt sorry for my father. Then Sensei suddenly turned to his wife. Shizu, do you think you'll die before me? Why? No reason. Just wondering. Or maybe I'll go before you. Usually, it's the husband who dies first and the wife who remains. That's not always the case, but men are usually older. So, that's why they die first. Then I'm supposed to go before you. You're different. Really? You're so healthy. You've hardly ever been sick. I'll definitely go before you. You think so? Yes, definitely. Sensei looked at me. I smiled. But if I go first, what would you do? What would I do? The wife faltered. A sudden wave of imagined grief seemed to wash over her. But when she looked up again, her mood had shifted. What would I do? There's nothing I could do. That's life. The young may die before the old, as they say. She said this with a joking tone, deliberately looking at me as she did. Chapter 35. I sat back down, waiting for the conversation to reach a natural end. What do you think? Sensei asked me. Whether he or his wife would die first was not something I could judge. I only laughed. No one can tell. It's all fate. That's true. Lifespans are determined at birth. My parents, you know, they died almost at the same time. On the same day? Not quite the same day, of course, but close, one after the other. This was news to me, and I was surprised. Why did they die so close together? The wife tried to answer, but Sensei cut in. Let's not talk about that. It's not worth it. He exaggerated the flutter of his fan, then turned back to his wife. Shizu, when I die, I'll leave this house to you. She laughed. Throw in the land too. The land belongs to someone else, but everything I own, I'll give to you. Thanks, but I don't need your foreign books. Sell them to a second-hand store. How much would they fetch? Sensei didn't answer, but the conversation never strayed far from the subject of his death. He always spoke as though it would surely happen before hers. At first, the wife seemed to respond lightly, but eventually, the sentiment weighed heavily on her. How many times do you have to say when I die? Please, for heaven's sake, stop. It's bad luck. When the time comes, I'll do everything according to your wishes, so just leave it at that. Sensei turned to the garden and smiled, but he said no more to upset her. The conversation had gone on long enough, and I stood to leave. Sensei and his wife accompanied me to the entrance. Take good care of your father, the wife said. See you in September, said Sensei. I bowed and stepped out past the lattice. A dense cluster of fragrant olive trees between the entrance and the gate stretched its branches as if to block my path, cloaked in the darkness. I looked up at their dark leaves and imagined the scent and flowers of the coming autumn. I had always linked Sensei's home and this tree together in my memory. Just as I stood before it, thinking of returning to this entrance next autumn, the porch light that had been shining through the lattice flicked off. Sensei and his wife had gone back inside. I stepped alone into the dark street. I didn't go straight back to my boarding house. I had some shopping to finish before returning home, and my full stomach needed a walk. I wandered toward the lively part of town. It was still early in the evening, and people with no apparent errands were walking about. Among them, I ran into a fellow graduate. He dragged me into a bar, where I listened to him spouting off like beer foam. I got back to my lodging after midnight. Chapter 36. The next day, despite the heat, I went out to purchase the items I had been asked to buy. When I received the list in the letter, it had seemed like nothing, but when it came time to actually do it, I found it terribly troublesome. As I wiped the sweat from my face on the tram, I felt a deep resentment toward these country folk who had not the slightest regard for other people's time and effort. I had no intention of spending the whole summer idly. I had drawn up a schedule for my time back home, and in order to follow it, I needed to get certain books. I had resolved to spend half the day on the second floor of Maruzen. I stood before the shelves containing books related to my field of interest and inspected them one by one, from end to end. Of all the shopping I did, what troubled me the most was buying women's Hanari collars. When I asked the clerk, he brought out a large variety, but when it came to choosing one, I was simply at a loss. On top of that, the prices were extremely inconsistent. When I thought something was cheap and asked the price, it turned out to be quite expensive. When I assumed something was expensive and didn't ask, it turned out to be surprisingly cheap. There were even some where, no matter how closely I compared them, I could not understand the reason for the difference in price. I was truly at a loss. In my heart, I regretted not having asked Sensei's wife for help. I bought a bag. Of course, it was just a cheap domestic product, but the shiny metal fittings were enough to impress country folk. The purchase of the bag had been one of my mother's requests. She had written in her letter that, after graduation, I should buy a new bag and pack all the souvenirs into it to bring back. I laughed when I read that. It wasn't that I didn't understand my mother's thinking, but rather that her words struck me as somehow comical. As I told Sensei and his wife when I said my goodbyes, I left Tokyo 3 days later and returned home by train. Since that winter, I had received various words of caution from Sensei regarding my father's illness, and although I was in the position to be most concerned, for some reason, it didn't weigh on me very heavily. Instead, I felt more sympathy when I imagined my mother alone after my father's passing. That being the case, somewhere in my heart, I must have already resigned myself to the idea that my father would not survive. In a letter I sent to my brother in Kyushu, I wrote that there was little hope of our father ever regaining his former health. At one point I even wrote that, though he might be busy with work, he should try to make time to come home just once this summer, even if only to show his face. I even used sentimental expressions, saying that it must be terribly lonely for our elderly parents to be living alone in the countryside, and that we, as their children, should feel deeply regretful. I wrote what came to mind as I felt it, but my feelings after writing were not the same as those while writing. I reflected on such contradictions during the train ride. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like a fickle and frivolous person. I became uncomfortable. Then I recalled Sensei and his wife again. In particular, I remembered the conversation we had when I was invited to dinner 2 or 3 days prior. Which one of us will die first, I wonder? I repeated to myself the question that had arisen between Sensei and his wife that evening. And I thought, no one can answer that with any certainty. But what if it were known clearly who would die first? What would Sensei do then? What would his wife do? I suppose that both of them would have no choice but to continue living as they were now. Just as I, unable to do anything, had left my father approaching death behind in the countryside. I saw human beings as fleeting creatures. I saw the inborn frivolity that we cannot control as something equally ephemeral.